Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, this is The Metro, a slice of news, culture, and conversation. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today on the program, it's been 15 years since the Supreme Court case Citizens United, which has kept dark money flowing into politics.
We want to know who exactly are the big winners and losers today in Michigan and nationwide. And we'll take your calls.
Plus, we'll hear from a member of the Jewish community about their reaction to the Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
And we flip through the pages of some new books coming from the small but mighty Wayne State University Press.
But first, the opioid epidemic hasn't loosened its grip enough on our country. More than 100,000 people died from overdoses last year. But that's a decrease in comparison to recent years after decades of rising fatalities. And that decrease has provided a light, a glimmer, that tells us something is working. One of the key public health interventions that's made a big impact is increasing people's access to naloxone, known by the brand Narcan. That drug can save a person's life by reversing an opioid overdose while it's happening.
That's right, Tia. Naloxone has become crucial in the face of the opioid epidemic. In Wayne County, all it takes is a press of a button, and you can now access naloxone from a vending machine in dozens of locations. The effort also includes newspaper-style porch boxes for even quicker access. And lots of groups and businesses are getting on board. We're talking churches, universities, and libraries. The initiative is a collaboration between Wayne County Department of Health, Human and Veteran Services and Wayne State University's School of Social Work. Here to discuss this in more detail are two people who've been on the ground working on this project. Tara King is the Community Behavioral Health Administrator for Wayne County, and Alexandria Hughes is a Research Assistant and Project Coordinator at Wayne State University Center for Behavioral Health and Justice. Tara and Alexandria, welcome to the Metro.
Pleasure meeting you. Thank you for having us on.
First, of course. First, Tara, I want to get a better grasp on overdose deaths in Wayne County. We know that last year, the national and state rates of overdose deaths decreased for the first time since 2018. What about when we zoom in on Wayne County? Has it also seen a decrease in overdose deaths that mirror these broader trends?
Yeah, and I appreciate the spotlight of some of the national trends because noting the decrease in overdose deaths is huge. When we look at Wayne County, however, Wayne County is disproportionately impacted by overdose deaths. And so the rate of decline, while we're anticipating marginal reduction in overdose deaths locally, has not necessarily mirrored the same trends that we see statewide and nationally. And so there's an eye towards the impact that it's having locally, and certainly a recognition and commitment from our executive leadership, both with Executive Evans and HHBS Director Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, to address the local overdose crisis with urgency.
Tara, can you talk about some of the factors that are contributing to the disproportionate impacts we're seeing in Wayne County when it comes to overdose deaths?
Yeah, I think largely the disproportionate impacts kind of mirror and echo broader systemic factors that we're really looking at. And so we know kind of what the landscape is locally in that individuals, Black and African-American individuals, are disproportionately impacted with rates of overdose death at nearly twice that of white individuals. And so one of the pieces that we really want to look at is a broader focus on social drivers of health and some of those upstream interventions partnered with harm reduction efforts, including naloxone distribution. And for some listeners, there may be familiarity with naloxone or Narcan, but I think it's important to just raise awareness about what naloxone or Narcan is. And what it is a life-saving tool that is safe and effective in reversing opioid overdose overdoses.
Right, right. And naloxone, again, that will actually reverse an overdose as it's happening. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, Tara, and that is the social determinants of health. And those are specifically some of the factors that are hitting people of color harder when it comes to overdose deaths. Can you just, as briefly as you can, tell us what those are?
Yeah, largely it's the conditions in which people work, live, kind of exist. And so access to supports, services, education, employment, housing, all of those pieces really come into play as far as factors of consideration.
Thanks for that, Tara. And Alexandria, let's talk a little bit more about these vending machines and the porch boxes that include naloxone, which, again, we will continue to say that reverses a drug overdose while it's happening. Now, they also include the vending machines and porch boxes, fentanyl and xylazine testing strips. The latter is a veterinary sedative linked to overdose. Before we discuss fentanyl, what can you tell us, Alexandria, about the growing use of xylazine?
Yes. So what I can tell you is that xylazine is something that um, a lot of people tend to, so for overdose, chances for overdose increases when using xylazine. And xylazine testing strips is used to test for xylazine within the drugs that you are using. And for the vending machines and porch boxes, this is something we place within them at the same rate to make folks have access to that wherever they can.
And so, like fentanyl, is xylazine something that is appearing in a lot of different drugs, and that's where the concern comes in, that it's sort of masquerading within other drugs that people think that they're buying, and not realizing that xylazine is also in that drug.
Yes, exactly. So xylazine is something and that increases the potency of the drug, and a lot of time is sold illegally. And with the xylazine testing strips, you're able to go ahead and detect whether or not those drugs contains that.
Okay, Alexandria, now on to fentanyl. I remember speaking with a DEA agent last year. He told me the media couldn't possibly report enough on the problem of fentanyl and the number of lives it's taking. Could you talk about how pervasive and insidious fentanyl is?
Yes. Overdose due to fentanyl has continued to rise. The overdose deaths reported. So in 2022, that was reported with the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It took 73,838 lives, and it's continued to increase since then.
Tara, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add in terms of what the impact looks like in Wayne County, 4 out of 5, it's actually slightly more than that, but 4 out of 5 of overdose deaths are driven by fentanyl. I think the other piece is also looking at polysubstance, what we would call polydrug. So that's involvement of more than one substance in drug involved deaths. So those two factors are especially with contamination in the presence of fentanyl in the wider drug supply.
Now, Tara, what exactly does the research say about providing people with easy access to naloxone and fentanyl and xylazine testing strips?
Yeah, I think linkage, access, knowledge, kind of empowerment, access to naloxone and drug testing strips are largely harm reduction strategies. And so, for reference, on the national level, harm reduction efforts are evidence-based and are part of the U.S. Health and Human Services overdose response strategy, overdose prevention strategy. At the state level with Michigan, harm reduction kind of sits within its own category as a prioritized pillar. And locally, we know harm reduction strategies and efforts work. So the aim is, how do we increase access broadly, especially in communities that have been most impacted, where there are limited barriers, easy access, and availability to naloxone and drug testing supplies.
So the more access that people have to naloxone, the more likely we're going to see the rate of overdose deaths go down. Is that fair to say?
I think the aim is that by increasing knowledge, awareness, and access, we have kind of a multi-pronged approach, not only in reducing the stigma that is often associated with overdose and substance misuse, but also empowering the community to better understand, use, and have access and availability to those life-saving tools.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Tara King of Wayne County Department of Health, Human and Veteran Services, and Alexandria Hughes from Wayne State's Center for Behavioral Health and Justice about a collaboration that's making the life-saving drug naloxone accessible to more people in Wayne County. So, Tara, how have you all determined where exactly to place the distribution centers?
That's a great question. And I would open the floor as well to Alexandria at any point if she would like to add. But one of the things that we really value is the collaboration between the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice and Alexandria and her colleagues, as well as leadership at CBHA, has done a tremendous job in helping support this initiative. I think one of the things to acknowledge is work that has come before. There's been a lot of work that's done locally by harm reduction providers, syringe service program providers to do similar efforts. And this kind of builds on that at scale to identify locations. Our aim is to have access points in each of the communities throughout Wayne County. There's 43 different municipalities, with the hope of increasing access over time as we kind of move into different parts of this project for communities that have been most impacted.
Alexandria, same question to you. In what ways do you all determine where to place the distribution centers?
So it's more of a two-pronged approach. So looking to harm reduction organizations and studies that have been done to say where would be a successful placement. So, for example, there's been studies done by Allison O'Rourke, Jessica Johnson, and others that talk about the implementation of Narcan vending machines to prevent overdose. And it discusses the need to place them as low barrier as possible in a place where would not be of high surveillance because there has been a trend of those who are drug users not wanting to access naloxone in places that have high police surveillance or are in close proximity of police. So we incorporate these studies and the life experiences of other community members with our placement criteria, which has 8 different things that we look at when considering placement at a location. Some of those are being in compliance with the American with Disabilities Act, ample lighting, as well as low proximity to police and surveillance.
Which, Alexandria, thank you so much, because that was going to be one of the questions that I had, was the fear or the hesitancy in using the vending machines in public spaces. I know oftentimes those, even if it's the fear of the police, but just the fear of being seen as something that you don't want to be seen as. So if we could just get into that a little bit as well, the responses that you all have received from some of those who are hosting these vending machines in newspaper-style porch boxes. I'm staying with you, Alexandria.
Yes. So the responses, one that we have received pretty commonly, there's been some misinformation in the community. Mm-hmm. So a belief that having a naloxone distribution station will increase the likelihood of drug use, which is absolutely false. And the opposite has been shown. These are some of the myths we've had to dispel. And in general, there's a need for more education on harm reduction tools and how they do save lives.
And Alexandria, this is just like I guess you can say like a little note here, but there was recently a rapper who passed away from a drug overdose. And I often thought to myself, well, if he had access to life-saving drugs, or if those around him had access to life-saving drugs, he would still be here today. So how important is it for us to understand naloxone, the use of it, Narcan, and to put it into the public sphere as something that should be carried with us as if we're carrying Tylenol or an aspirin? And I'm going to talk to you, Tara, first.
Thanks so much. I think to add as well, I just wanted to add on the prior discussion in emphasizing the importance as well of community engagement and community partnership, and really helping support placement and kind of tailored decisions that are crafted and responsive to community needs. That's a huge part of this project. And I think it's ultimately the thing that will help enhance and optimize the impact of anything that comes out of this. So I just wanted to put forth kind of the importance of community engagement and partnership in play. The piece, to your point, is really around how important it is to have naloxone available. And I think messaging, awareness, we have a website that was recently launched alongside this. It will be built out over the next few months or so. It's endoverdosewayne.org, but trying to be intentional in having sort of layered approaches to how we want to support this initiative. So in the coming months, we'll be supporting broader communications around this, both in social media. The aim would be to do some gas station videos, having this website, and really doing broader community messaging to help increase awareness and education.
And Alexandria, is the part of the messaging about training, how easy is it for people to use? Do people need training, and where can they find out more info about it?
Yeah, so I would advise everyone listening to check out the website endoverdosewayne.org. There are resources there on how to use Narcan. And it is something that's relatively easy to use. So it's a nasal spray, class medication, opiate antagonist, and it can be administered placing it in the nose. So it's not very difficult to use, and that is something that we make sure to provide instructions on with each case of naloxone that anyone takes. And I just wanted to make a point as well on your question in regards to the importance of people having access to naloxone and being aware of the need. And so in Wayne County, there's 1.8 million people, and it's comprised of 43 unique cities and towns. And there's varying degrees of overdose risk. Within Wayne County, the poverty rate is 7% higher than the state's, which is 20.5%. Wayne County has received the highest possible score on the Center of Disease and Control of Prevention Social Vulnerability Index. And that measures socioeconomic status, housing, characteristics like being a single parent, for example. And I say that because with our research, we have seen the connections between overdose as well as poverty. And this is why it is important for everyone to have access to naloxone.
Tara King is the Community Behavioral Health Administrator for Wayne County, and Alexandria Hughes is a research assistant and project coordinator at Wayne State University's Center for Behavioral Health and Justice. Tara and Alexandria, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From the WDET newsroom, Michigan's race for governor is heating up. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson announced her candidacy for the Democratic nomination this morning. Republican Senator Eric Nesbitt and Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan are already in the race. Duggan is running as an independent.
Coming up at 11, this week marks 15 years since the landmark Supreme Court ruling Citizens United came down, setting a precedent that corporations have the rights of people and opening the door for obscene amounts of money flowing into our political system. So what do you think? Would you like to see Congress act to overturn Citizens United? The number is 313-577-1019.
Up next, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but it's a fragile one. We spoke to members of the Jewish community in Metro Detroit to get their reaction to the long-awaited ceasefire. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. On Sunday, a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel began. Around 90 Palestinian prisoners and detainees were freed from Israeli jails, and 3 Israeli women were set free by Hamas. Metro producer Sam Corey sat down with David Kurzman, Senior Director for the Jewish Federation of Detroit, to discuss how Jews in Metro Detroit are reacting to the news.
For members of the Jewish community of Metro Detroit, this was a very important day, and it was a long time coming. 15 months of heartache and of really living moment to moment with our brothers and sisters in Israel and the kind of challenges that they've endured, not knowing the fate of their loved ones who have been in captivity held by Hamas and other terror organizations. So to get the news of a deal last week, which we welcomed with cautious optimism, and we even saw it was precarious, kind of hour to hour would it go through, but that was encouraging. And then on Sunday to see 3 young women return home, Romy, Emily, Daron, those names echo for us now as we could finally exhale, really. And it was a very powerful, emotional moment for the people of Israel. And that's an emotion shared by community members here.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there because I'd like you to draw out a little bit the connection between people who are members of the Federation, who are living around Detroit or the metro area, to Israel. What does that look like?
So the mission of the Jewish Federation of Detroit is to take care of the needs of the Jewish community locally across this region, but also around the world. And that, of course, includes the state of Israel, where about half of world Jewry live. So the fate of the Israeli people, the fate of our brothers and sisters there is so tied up in our own story. For many of us, it's friends, even family, who are experiencing this trauma on a day-to-day basis. And so for us, we're one people, it's one heartbeat. And when we're going through these difficult times, I think very much, despite the distance, we're experiencing it together.
There is a lot of talk of an uptick in anti-Semitism since October 7th, 2023. Much of this has been recorded by the Anti-Defamation League. What are the actions of anti-Semitism that you're seeing?
We've seen anti-Semitism at levels unknown to us, completely historic levels, and in so many different parts of society. You know, for some time, you might associate it with some radicalism on campus, but it's grown so far beyond that, where we're seeing individuals being targeted, whether it's in workplaces, in schools, sometimes at their homes. Our Jewish Federation building has been targeted 3 times in the past 15 months. Incidents of graffiti and vandalism. These are direct attacks against the Jewish community. And so you could say we, of course, can have differences about politics or policy or, who's in the right or in the wrong 6,000 miles away. But to see those conflicts come home to our front door, it affects people in a very deep way. It's sowing fear. It's making people angry. And we're really wondering, when will it stop?
I'm curious how you think about the distinction between criticizing Israel and being anti-Jewish. I think these things are slippery because Israel is a Jewish state. Israel is a Jewish nation. And as you said, half of world Jewry is in Israel. At the same time, we criticize countries. We criticize nation states. I certainly do this here of America. I imagine at times you do as well. And we do of other countries around the world. Where is that line for you?
There's a robust conversation, especially in Israel, right? Just look at the newspapers, look at social media in Israel. There's a great discussion and debate and it gets really angry about who's at fault for October 7th and the security failures. How are we going to get out of this mess? There's so many things that can be debated, and governments can be criticized, ought to be criticized. That's obviously not a red line. Anybody who says that is distorting the facts. The reality is Israel, like any other country, ought to be criticized when it makes mistakes. And it can be criticized unfairly for that matter. That's not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is when you start holding an entire group of people responsible for the actions of a state or the actions of a government. Anti-Semitism is when you get into age-old conspiracies, myths, anti-Semitic canards that are the things that have followed the Jewish community for centuries, well before the establishment of the State of Israel. Anti-Semitism is attacking individual Jews, Jewish businesses, Jewish organizations during a time of tension and crisis.
I really do want you to draw this out if you can. The examples of anti-Semitism, certainly, a swastika, I think is an obvious one, is a more obvious one. But if there is, Palestinian flags put up around a Jewish building, or like, what are we talking about here? What kinds of things that you're seeing that really accentuate the kind of hate towards Jewish people?
Sure. So again, I think we could look at some of these studies and unpack the types of incidents, but in the space of vandalism, like you said, right? A swastika, clear sign of hate that we're all aware of. Flying a flag, probably not. Vandalizing a building with F the Jews, F Israel, a gesture of Free Palestine, spray painted, graffitied on a Jewish Federation building. My question would be, how does that advance that cause, right? How does that lead to a future of hopefully security and peace for all the people who are in the crosshairs of this terrible, terrible war? So you have to, I think, look at it on a case-by-case basis. And we, as a community, have to, of course, be careful in how we use that term. Anti-Semitism is a heavy accusation. And so I can tell you at the Jewish Federation, we are very cautious in when we apply that to a situation, and we evaluate matters based on the facts.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm producer Sam Corey, speaking with David Kurzman, the Senior Director of Community Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Detroit. We're discussing the ceasefire that's happening between Israel and Hamas and the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners in Israel and what it means for folks here in Southeast Michigan. David, the Federation has offered spaces for people to grieve over the last 15 months. What are those spaces like? And I'm curious what kinds of things gets discussed in those spaces.
So you're correct that one of the primary functions of a federation is to take care of the needs of the community and to hold a community together during crisis. We've never experienced the scale of this type of event, right? Typically, it would be a few weeks of a war and very difficult moments, but that would pass. To be well over a year, 15 months into this level of war and crisis where Israel faces existential threats, the long arm of Iran on all of its borders. This is something that we're feeling, again, through our Israeli brothers and sisters and their experience, but we also feel it here at home. So you're right. We've had multiple opportunities for large community gatherings, people to be in a space where they feel safe, where they feel that they're among others, and a chance to just be together.
There's a lot of emotion that's wrapped up in the current state of things, and certainly historically. There's just a lot of weight behind it. I am wondering how much is offered in those spaces, or how much those spaces turn political. And when I say that, I'm wondering if there's discussions about frustrations with actions taken by Israel. Is there sort of looking at Israeli national policy and changes that have been happening in that country? Do the conversations ever go in that direction?
Certainly. There's a robust debate, as I said earlier, in Israel, and I think that political debate is reflected in the United States as well. Our job at the Federation specifically is to strengthen the bond between the Israeli people and our community. In my experience, people who have a personal relationship with someone in Israel, where they're in frequent communication, how are you? What's going on? How are you processing the moment? I heard that there's sirens going off. Another rocket has been launched by the Houthis in Yemen. It's not a headline. It's not a tweet. It's actually someone's lived experience. So to be able to sit with them, in a sense, even if it's virtually, right, and to be in conversation with them, that is something that we facilitate. It's also a complicated place, right? Needless to say, Israel. It's a complicated place. The issues around how we got here and how we'll get out of it and where this may lead, they're hard for people who may not have the background in it. So part of our role is to educate. And education has to be multifaceted. It's not to teach a specific viewpoint. It's to bring lots of perspectives. There's a younger generation that isn't familiar with the full spectrum of Israeli politics because they've seen a single type of politics leading the country for some time now. So to bring them back to understand the diversity, what is Zionism? What are the different visions for what Zionism was intended to be, what it is today? And then especially as the lens gets distorted, as they see, by those who wish to manipulate or have other intentions around, redefining Zionism as something that it wasn't. It's about the national aspirations of the Jewish people. Its Declaration of Independence says it aspires to live in peace with its neighbors. These are conversations to have. And how is Israel fulfilling that dream? And how could it be fulfilling it better in the future?
There's a lot to that history. And as you noted in the politics, Israel's politics have turned much, much, much further right-wing, particularly in the last couple decades. In terms of the education, I do wonder how much is covered on particularly the Palestinian perspective. And the reason I bring this up is because I'm Jewish, and I've spoken to a number of young Jewish people who, over the course of 15 months, have told me that they really feel like they've been lied to about the history of Israel. Not that there aren't good things about Israel, not that there aren't good things about Israeli and Israeli society, and that it's a dynamic and rich and interesting place to be. But they say that, listen, I didn't know about so much of the tragedy that had been inflicted upon Palestinians. And I do wonder if you think about the role of the Federation in teaching young Jewish people also about Palestinian perspectives, Palestinian histories, Palestinian culture today.
We have a lot of work to do to broaden the education of our young people so that they see the full picture. Israel is not about a single narrative. It's a rich, diverse, complex place. And to understand it, you have to dive into all of it. And that's not just with, a narrow lens. It's to go to meet the people, to understand what they're all about. And yes, to meet the diversity of Israel, right? 20% of its population being Arab, not Jewish, right? People who have way different backgrounds, but now have been living together for decades. It's actually reflected in our partnership region, which is sort of like a sister city program that we have in the north of Israel, in the Galilee. And last May, I had an opportunity to be there and visit with colleagues and friends. And as I was following ways to get to my meeting in the morning, it took me kind of in a roundabout way around some traffic on the main highway. I was going through Arab villages the whole time. These are neighbors. Every sign is in Arabic. I think there's a misperception that, the Israeli narrative is all about pushing out those who are not Jewish. That's not the vision. It's not the vision for many. Of course, there are extremists. There are extremists who have their agendas, and some of them have found more traction than many of us would like to see. That's a project of Israel continuing to develop its democratic character and not relinquishing that. All the while, it remains the only Jewish state. So it's about giving young people, as you said, the opportunity to learn more, to be exposed to more perspectives, and giving them the full picture. I grew up with an education on Israel that I think could have been broader, frankly. And I think we've recognized that within our school system. And we're doing more to expose our students to this diversity. It makes us a stronger community at the end of the day.
What does the broadening look like? Is it just Arab Israelis, or is it also Palestinians living in the West Bank and living in Gaza?
Absolutely. That's part of it. It's the full thing. You cannot separate Israel from its neighbors. Yes, there's this vision that, we'll separate the two people and that'll be the end of it. We know that our fates, the fates of those who live there, are linked, and that to get through this what feels like get out of the abyss, really, right? Feels like the lowest of the low. To pull ourselves out, it's going to be seeing the humanity in the other. And that's a two-way street, right? Israelis and Jews say, where's the recognition of a Jewish state and why so much condemnation of Israel doing actions to protect itself? Well, in turn, we have to recognize that there are people here, Palestinians who have been on the land for generations, and they too should be able to fulfill their national aspirations.
I know the Federation facilitates trips to Israel. Is there an interest in showing and getting folks to see sort of the full picture of what's happening in the West Bank, where settlements have expanded, where it's really, really hard for Palestinians to get around, where water is really scarce for some, and that some is Palestinians, and it's pretty rich in much wealthier, settled Israeli communities. Is there an interest in showing, like you're saying, the full picture of Israeli society, and part of that is the West Bank? Is there interest in that too?
I think there's interest. I think the opportunity is linked to the situation on the ground. And we're in a really tough spot to be able to be making commitments to that type of activity, just to be completely frank. And I think we're in a point where things need to stabilize. We need to get through this nightmare, this storm. This is a time for, I think, all people of good conscience to be putting pressure on the party that began this thing, this horrible nightmare, Hamas, that crossed the border and butchered and kidnapped, to try to get them to give up the hostages, put this terror behind us, and move towards a more hopeful future, so that it's not a party that continues to take whatever comes in to build up a regime that seeks the annihilation of its neighbor, but rather to build a more hopeful future. With that more hopeful future, I think you'll find many willing partners.
I understand the inclination and why it's important for Jewish people to support Israel. At least certainly I've been taught that as a kid. I understand why that's taught. I wonder if you think it's important for Jewish people also to hold, or to attempt to hold, Israeli society, Israeli government accountable for its actions. And seeing as, we're pretty far away, if that's true, I do wonder what you think that looks like.
I think what's important is to strengthen the connection with the people. If you're a liberal, a progressive American Jew, and you're concerned about progressive issues in Israel, we should be strengthening that bridge to connect with the Israelis who feel just the same.
Tell me what that looks like.
Well, that looks like going back to just before October 7th, 2023, when Israeli society was at war with itself because the character of the state was something being hotly debated. Their eye was actually off of the security issues because there are so many issues unresolved within a young, fraught democracy of only some 70-something years. So there, we had an opportunity to connect those with, say, the protest movement that was looking for more democratic values and ideals to be seen in society. And I wouldn't say we, the Federation, but we American Jews could be connecting and facilitating that dialogue so that we're not just, again, reading current events through headlines, but actually doing it through a discourse, connecting with the people in Israel. It's also getting people to experience society themselves. You have to go there, not on a few-day trip where you just see a few sites, but actually go into people's homes, engage with them, understand what concerns them, what makes them tick, and what they're all about. And in that way, we can build new connections, deeper connections, and maybe there is some new thinking that can emerge, but that's only going to happen through relationships and trust. It's not going to happen through trying to have some say in a political system where American Jews really don't.
That was Metro producer Sam Corey speaking with David Kurzman of the Jewish Federation of Detroit. After Sam's conversation with David, there was more violence in Palestine. On Tuesday, the Israeli military launched a large raid in the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank, killing 10 people and injuring 40 others. That's according to Palestinian health officials. What's more, related to anti-Semitism. On Monday, at a speech on Donald Trump's presidential victory, Elon Musk made a straight-arm gesture resembling a Nazi salute. The Anti-Defamation League, which is a Jewish organization that much of the world looks to when anti-Semitism is expressed, wrote on X that Musk made a, quote, awkward gesture in a moment of enthusiasm. Many Jews around the world criticize the Anti-Defamation League for their comments.
From the WDET newsroom, Detroit City Councilman Fred Durhal plans to announce next week whether he's running for mayor this year. He would challenge Council President Mary Sheffield and Thaw CEO Chantil Jenkins, with more candidates likely to come. And coming up at 11, Citizens United allowed the flow of dark money and super PACs into American politics. We'll open the phone lines, and we're asking you, is there too much money in politics? Do wealthy donors and corporations have too much power? The number is 313-577-1019.
Up next, Wayne State University's press joins us to discuss some books you maybe haven't read but should. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. And while every season feels like reading season, right now feels especially like the time to curl up with a book. And if you're looking to find some interesting reads, Wayne State University Press might be a place to start. Since 1941, the University Press has published more than 2,000 titles that explore such a wide range of topics.
And Robin, that's why joining us in studio now to give us a sample of its offerings is Stephanie Williams. Stephanie is the Senior Director of the Wayne State University Press. Stephanie, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. So before we get into some of the books University Press has published, let's get a better understanding of your process. What common themes or subjects does the University Press look for?
Well, so university presses across the state, there are 3 in the state of Michigan and across the country, have different areas of specialization. And generally speaking, they reflect the strengths of the university where they are housed. So our strongest publishing areas are nonfiction in Detroit, in Michigan, in Great Lakes history and culture, African American and Jewish studies, fairy tale studies, which we at Wayne State have an excellent program in fairy tale studies. So we're really lucky to be able to publish fiction and poetry with an emphasis on writers working and living in the city and in the state of Michigan.
That's so cool to have a collection of books that reflect our city and our state. That's great. So the press has published thousands of books since it started in 1941. So there is a long tradition of finding works that the press finds valuable. Mm-hmm. How do you determine if the work should be published?
Well, we get about 400 submissions a year. And so the submission guidelines are on our website, in case anyone's interested. The first step in the process is to discover whether a manuscript fits on our list. Can this manuscript become a successful book with us? And then our acquisitions editors also consult with series editors. And then they send the book out for 2 peer reviews that recommend publication. So these are people who are experts in the field, who are scholars on the subject. And even the writer benefits from the advice and recommendations of these peer reviewers. So there's yet another step after that. After we get the peer review reports in and share those with the author, they may, do a little polishing. It goes to our faculty editorial board. And so this is 14 members of the Wayne State faculty who gather about every 6 weeks to review the peer review reports and the manuscripts and give us a go-ahead to publish these books.
Intense.
Yes.
It's intense, Stephanie. It's intense, but I wouldn't expect anything less from those who are just passionate about storytelling and making sure they're spreading that love of storytelling. So let's get into the recommendations. When Detroit Played the Numbers is one of the first books in this collection you recommend. It's written by Felicia George, an anthropology professor at Wayne State University. Tell us about the book and what it stands for and why it stands out to you.
Yeah, so one of the reasons this book stands out to me is because Felicia was still working on her PhD at Wayne State when she submitted a proposal to us about this book. Now, this book is a revision of her dissertation, but it is very, very readable. And so one of the things that's important to me as director of the press right now is that our books, even our scholarly books, are communicating with a public that are able to make this scholarly information available to everyday people. Yes, and accessible. That's right. That's right. That book has won a lot of awards, including a Michigan Notable Books Award. Some people may have seen the announcement in the Sunday edition of the Detroit Free Press. We're the only publisher with 2 books on this year's list, so that's exciting.
And Stephanie, just a little bit about this, just about briefly, 30 seconds or so, because we talk about the book, of course, the numbers game. And for those who are not familiar, what does that mean, the numbers, playing the numbers?
So the numbers game is kind of foundational to the development of the modern lottery, including the Michigan Lottery. It is a game of chance that formed the foundation for generational wealth for a number of Detroit families and institutions.
This is the Metro from 101.9 WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking with Stephanie Williams of the Wayne State University Press about its work and some of its new books. Stephanie, we know small publishing houses and big ones alike have faced a lot of challenges in the face of Amazon. I wonder, have you seen things get worse or better? In other words, has there been a resurging interest in smaller independent presses, or is it still a huge struggle?
I love this question. Thank you for asking. I started working in publishing before Amazon existed. And so I've kind of watched this whole evolution of the business, also as a reader and as a patron of independent booksellers. And so, there was a time when that particular retail outlet was viewed as harmless, and then they kind of came to have so much power. So 65% of our book sales are through that one website.
Wow.
And they call the tune. They decide how much discount they're going to receive off the retail price. They tell you when to ship. They tell you how to ship. They tell you what the boxes have to look like. All of that. So it fits in the automation of their system. Now, I think over the last 5 to 10 years, there has been an absolute resurgence in independent booksellers. And here in Detroit, we are so lucky to have as many strong, interesting, diverse independent bookstores as we do.
It is striking. I think that is something that I noted when I moved back to the city. It was the number of independent booksellers, which in a lot of places we're seeing those evaporate.
Right.
So, okay, in the last minute or so that we have, tell us something you're reading from the press, from Wayne State University's press, or that you have read recently that you want to talk about.
So I'm probably biased, but I have to say that one of our recent memoirs called Rust Belt Reporter by John Gallagher is one of the books that has helped me learn more about the city of Detroit. Unfortunately, I'm not from here.
It's okay. We welcome you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Open arms.
Where are you
You're
from?
home now.
So I'm from Louisiana.
Where 10 feet of snow
yes,
has just descended upon people, much to some chagrin and some
Shocking,
delight. Yes.
shocking
Yes.
snow. But John's career at the Detroit Free Press spanned 32 years. And so his memoir kind of tells the story of Detroit's troubles and the resurgence and richness that we find in the city today.
Okay, and tell us the name of that book one more time.
That is Rust Belt Reporter by John Gallagher.
Stephanie Williams is the senior director of the Wayne State University Press. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Coming up, what is dark money and how has the Supreme Court ruling Citizens United impacted American politics? We're opening up those phone lines, 313-577-1019.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Stay with us. It's the Metro.
Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Money in politics. It's always been a crack in the foundation of our democracy. But Citizens United, a Supreme Court ruling that overturned campaign finance laws by granting free speech rights to corporations, really deepened that crack. And dark money has been the cement to fill those cracks ever since. Lots of it. In the most recent election, donations to presidential super PACs surpassed $1 billion. That's billion with a B.
That's right, Robin. And we do have just a little bit of a montage here of some folks that we need to hear.
We begin with a landmark decision that dramatically reshapes the way federal elections are financed. The Supreme Court out with a ruling this morning, giving corporations the right to spend freely in elections for president and Congress.
We turn now to the movement to challenge corporate personhood, the notion that corporations have equal rights to individuals.
There is a reason why the middle class is disappearing, why poverty is increasing, and while the people on top are making out like bandits. And one of the reasons is the enormous influence that big money interests have over the political process, and the way they are able to use that influence is through campaign contributions and through lobbying efforts. They are all over the place.
There aren't a lot of functioning democracies around the world that work this way, where you can basically have millionaires and billionaires bankrolling whoever they want, however they want, in some cases undisclosed. And what it means is ordinary Americans are shut out of the process.
So, where does all that money come from? Good luck finding out. The campaign finance system we have in the United States, it's high on donations and low on accountability. So what do you think? Do campaign donations play too much to a role in our politics? The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Is there too much money being flown and thrown around in the American politics? So Today, 15 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision, we're taking a closer look at how Citizens United has changed American politics and asking, where do we go from here? Is campaign finance reform on the horizon, or is it just a pipe dream? What does dark money do to a democracy anyways? Our senior producer, David Lyons, has been working on today's show to try and answer those very questions. David, thank you for bringing this topic to us.
Yeah, of course. Happy to work with y'all on it.
Yeah, so the election is over, Dave, but that doesn't mean campaign finances and super PACs have become somehow irrelevant. What's up with that?
Well, yeah, we're talking about this today because, like you said, it's been 15 years now, as of yesterday, that Citizens United, the ruling came down from the Supreme Court. We're going to get into what exactly Citizens United was with our guest coming up, Daniel Weiner from the Brennan Center. But before we get into that, the question is why, right? Well, super PACs and dark money and money in politics, it's not new since Citizens United, but the way it's been characterized by a lot of legal experts, by a lot of elected officials who are against dark money in politics, such as Bernie Sanders, they think there's an outsized role in influence from big donors specifically. There's a question of accountability and transparency, and we have a new president in, and we want to look at what happened in this recent election, because this recent presidential election, there was record spending from super PACs and donations. So we want to unpack all of that 15 years later.
And that dark money, that means that it's pretty much untraceable, that we don't really know where it's coming from. And so, Dave, as you've noted, that means that there is a lack of accountability, that without that transparency, it's hard for us to understand who is filling the pockets of lawmakers. And we have an idea, though, based on the kinds of policies that sometimes we're seeing.
Yeah, it's one of the things that as journalists can be very frustrating, because we often want to follow the money, and because that tells us about intentions and motives and what to expect and who to talk to and what facts to look into. But oftentimes, if you're trying to find out who is supporting what candidate and which policies, you're going to end up with some super PAC name as the end of the road, and that doesn't offer a whole lot in terms of accountability. And on the Metro here, of course, we're here to talk about democracy and democratic participation. It's very important to us. We're very concerned about how people's personal economics are, for wealth inequality in this country, for disenfranchisement, all of the things that we talk about on a regular basis. A lot of those tie into policies that have been affected on the national level and the state level. We're going to talk about that today as well. But we want to know how much influence money really has in politics, and why we should really care that it's been 15 years since Citizens United. Why do we need to know about this ruling?
And how this can potentially make people feel like they are not being represented in politics. And then what are the ripple effects of that? Does that mean people retreat from politics? That's something, Tia, that you and I were talking about.
I would love to explore it. We will get a chance to explore it throughout the rest of this hour when we talk about the disconnect and why we've seen so many people disconnected from our American politics today. For myself, graduated high school in 2010. And so my whole adult life so far has been underneath this particular ruling. So seeing how some of it has come down and impacted my life as I've become an adult and tried to maneuver through this world, it's been very interesting to see how these things have come down and impacted me. So I want to dig deeper, learn a little bit more, find some connections, and hopefully have a little more of a grasp and understanding of what's going on with our American politics and this money.
Yeah, and I'm especially interested in hearing what our listeners think about money and politics in general, because it's not like everybody can agree that Citizens United was bad. It's not such a simple thing. It may seem like that to you. We'd love to hear from you. But some people might also say that this is the free market doing its thing. Yeah. The companies that are so powerful are in many ways powerful because people buy their products and they have that much power, but some people see that as a vote of confidence for these corporations. So I'm kind of curious if you're someone out there also who's thinking, I don't see what's wrong with this. Corporations using spending as free speech seems fine with me. We'd love to hear your perspective as well. Or maybe you've been following Citizens United and everything that came since for the last 15 years, and you're pretty turned up about it. we want to hear from you as well. That number is 313-577-1019. Let us know what you think about money and politics today. And we've got a couple of great guests coming up. Daniel Weiner from the Brennan Center and Simon Schuster from Bridge, Michigan. It's going to be a great hour.
So coming up, can the consequences of the Supreme Court cases that have kept dark money flowing into politics, that's Citizens United, as we've been talking about, can those consequences be undone 15 years later? And as our senior producer, David Lyons, has mentioned, we want to hear from you. Is there too much money in politics? Call and let us know. The number is 313-577-1019. Stay with us here on the Metro.
With a landmark decision that dramatically reshapes the way federal elections are financed, the Supreme Court out with a ruling this morning, giving corporations the right to spend freely in elections for president and Congress.
We turn now to the movement to challenge corporate personhood, the notion that corporations have equal rights to individuals.
There is a reason why the middle class is disappearing, why poverty is increasing, and while the people on top are making out like bandits. And one of the reasons is the enormous influence that big money interests have over the political process. And the way they are able to use that influence is through campaign contributions and through lobbying efforts. They are all over the place.
There aren't a lot of functioning democracies around the world that work this way, where you can basically have millionaires and billionaires bankrolling whoever they want, however they want, in some cases undisclosed. And what it means is ordinary Americans are shut out of the process.
We just heard from media outlets and lawmakers like Senator Bernie Sanders and former President Barack Obama talking about Citizens United, a landmark Supreme Court case that just turned 15. This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Citizens United, as you just heard Robin say, just turned 15 years old yesterday. The Supreme Court ruling overturned campaign finance laws and granted free speech rights to corporations. Dark money has flooded our campaigns ever since, and a lot of it has. In the most recent election, donations to presidential super PACs surpassed $1 billion. That's billion with a B. So what do you think? Is there too much money in politics? Do wealthy donors and corporations have too much power? Give us a call. It's 313-577-1019.
Today, we're taking a close look at how Citizens United has changed American politics, and we're asking, where do we go from here? Here to explain how dark money came to be so ingrained in our politics is Daniel Weiner, Director of Elections and Government Programs at the Brennan Center for Justice. Daniel, thank you for joining us today on the Metro.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision was January 21st, 2010. Let's start with the before times. Can you give me a big picture view of money in politics before that ruling?
Sure. No, I'm happy to. So money in politics and problems with money in politics certainly didn't start with Citizens United. It really, in some ways, is a concern that has been with us since the founding era, but picked up a lot of speed really with the advent of mass communications and particularly television and radio and the need to pay for all those ads. We started restricting some types of campaign money, particularly from corporations in the 19th century. After the Watergate scandal, which is, some people forget actually started as a campaign finance scandal, right? It was about the President Nixon having a slush fund that he was using in part to pay for the Watergate burglars. Congress passed a more comprehensive set of rules about how you could raise money for campaigns, how you could spend money for campaigns, and critically that transparency component. That set of rules was upheld in part and then struck down in part by the Supreme Court in a decision in the 70s called Buckley v. Valeo. And it's actually Buckley that made a few critical moves. One was to say that spending money on politics is basically a form of speech and entitled to sort of the similar protections that just speech that you or I might engage in is entitled to. And the other was to say if you are going to limit money in politics, really the only justification for doing that is to prevent bribery, corruption, not even sort of corruption in as we might commonly understand it, but really this narrow type of corruption, quid pro quos, which we often call bribery. And that actually represents a sort of way in which the United States diverged critically from other democracies that we think of as our peers, Canada, most of Western Europe, most of whom have always had a sense, and certainly in the modern era, that actually you could limit money in politics not just to prevent corruption, but also fundamentally to ensure that citizens broadly could have something like an equal voice in government. Probably not exactly equal, but at least that there was some sense that having vast concentrations of private wealth, along with political power combined, would be dangerous for democracy. And we certainly saw that ourselves in the 19th century with the Gilded Age. So did other countries. Most other countries wanted to prevent that. So we have the decision Buckley v. Valeo. That sort of is the regime throughout the 80s and the 90s. We continue to see problems with money in politics. Congress continues to push back. And the Supreme Court, which in that era was fairly moderate, basically greenlit, Congress's efforts to at least restrict some corporate campaign spending and impose some limits. Then the composition of the Supreme Court changes. Sandra Day O'Connor, in particular, who was a fairly moderate justice, retired and was replaced by Samuel Alito, who is usually considered to be a fairly conservative justice. And the majority on the court kind of snaps back the deference that they had offered to the other branches of governments with Citizens United. And we can talk about that ruling, but in some sense, it's less that it's a completely new thing than it represents a kind of reaffirmation and a recommitment to the sort of rigid principles that were first announced in Buckley.
Daniel,
and that means more permission for money in politics. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Let's talk about that 5-4 ruling. Let's move to Citizens United itself. What did the ruling actually say? And is it too simplistic to say that Citizens United meant money equals speech and corporations equal people?
Those are such good questions because I talk about this a lot at cocktail parties. Not that I get invited to a ton, but when I do, and that's always the thing. And there's an element of which some of the folks who defend Citizens United do have a point, particularly about the idea that corporations are people, right? Corporations aren't people, but Justice Scalia pointed out they are made up of people, and NPR is a type of corporation. The New York Times is a corporation. So to say that they don't have any First Amendment rights, that's fair. That is a problematic sentiment. But getting back to what Citizens United actually did, so Citizens United was a conservative nonprofit that wanted to distribute a video criticizing Hillary Clinton when she was running for president. They sued the Federal Election Commission, which is the agency that enforces campaign finance rules, for the permission to do this. The Supreme Court took the case. They could have issued a relatively narrow ruling, just saying, well, this is core First Amendment protected activity. The rules are generally constitutional, but they can't be applied here. And that's actually what Citizens United asked for. But instead, what this 5-4 majority of the court did is they took the opportunity of what seemed like a pretty narrow case to say, actually, this entire swath of rules is just unconstitutional. We're going to throw them out for everyone. Any restriction on corporations spending money on politics cannot be upheld as long as the corporation is notionally independent from a candidate. We can get into what that really means. And then they sort of made this move of saying, but, there are disclosure laws, so all this money will be transparent. Turns out that also was wrong. So in critical respects, what Citizens United did is it swept away rules based on some assumptions of the safeguards that still would be in place, assumptions that were incorrect. And that did fundamentally transform our politics in critical ways.
Daniel, how does a Supreme Court ruling on free speech then lead to unlimited campaign contributions from wealthy donors?
It's a really good question. So, Supreme Court issued its ruling, and it said that if an organization, whether it's a corporation or a union, is independent of a candidate, you can't restrict how much it spends on money. Lower courts looked at that ruling and said, well, if you can't restrict how much it spends on money, you also probably can't restrict how much it raises. And that was a case called Speech Now v. FEC, which was decided by the D.C. Circuit. Now all the other lower courts have joined in. That is actually the move that gives us super PACs, which are political action committees that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. Since that time, though, the Supreme Court has sent fairly clear signals that that was where it was headed. And that sort of birthed the super PAC era we live in today. Dark money actually comes because the Supreme Court and the lower courts seem to have sort of assumed that all this money that they were allowing to be spent would be transparent, that the sources would be disclosed. But it turns out that at the federal level and in many states, including Michigan, the laws and rules that require disclosure really just didn't contemplate this. They didn't expect to have corporations spending unlimited amounts of money on politics, and they didn't apply disclosure rules to those sorts of entities. Congress or the Michigan legislature could close those loopholes, but they have not been closed. So it is partly the Supreme Court, but it is very important. It is also partly the other branches of government that through their inaction have made the effects of this decision worse.
Daniel, I want to go to the phones and hear from Elisa in Grosse Pointe Park. Elisa, thanks for calling the Metro. I wonder, how do you feel about money in politics?
Good morning. I mean, I think like many folks, I feel like there's just an outsized influence of money in politics, and particularly the money that we can't quite follow is more unsettling. But way earlier in the conversation, as I was listening, I was just thinking about the terms that we use to discuss things and how, language kind of feels like it changes over time and things sort of don't mean what they used to. But the one thing that just really struck me this morning was the idea of campaign donations, political donations, and how a donation is usually seen as like a gift, like freely given, and how it's such a different case in politics. And, it's really more like payment for services expected or services rendered. And I just wish there was a way that we could remember to speak with precision about these kinds of realities where, like, we say things like donations, but they're not donations, or we call people donors, but they're not giving freely. They're giving with a lot of strings attached and a lot of expectations, and it's all made so much more hard to follow and hard to understand by these loopholes in the disclosure laws that the guest was just talking about, which feels just like such a total abdication of responsibility by the legislature. So,
Elisa, Thank you so much for calling the Metro. Daniel, what do you think? Is donation a misleading term when we talk about campaign fundraising? Elisa has a great point about precision in language. We here at the Metro, we're in the business of words, and I think you are to an extent as well, Daniel.
Yeah, the caller makes such an important point, about why people are giving. What I would say is that, there's a lot of evidence that people give for various reasons. Many of us, I know I have, maybe you have, give small contributions or donations to candidates who we support. And that, in that case, the word contribution or donation probably fits, because if you give a candidate $100, it's not clear to me that you expect anything in return from them. You just support their agenda. But it's very different when you give that candidate $10,000 or you give $1 million to a super PAC that backs a candidate. There, it seems more likely that maybe partly is about who you're sympathetic with, but oftentimes, not always, but often those donors or givers want something in return. And that's the little dance we do in our political system that has been forced on us by the Supreme Court, which is that if you expressly say, I'm giving you this $1 million and I expect, X in return, a tax break, you might have just committed bribery. But if you just kind of openly say you want to influence the politician, you want access to let them know your viewpoint, which happens to be that you really ought to get that tax break, that's just kind of politics, according to the Supreme Court. What's striking to me, of course, is most advanced democracies, we just sidestep all of that by having publicly funded elections. I shouldn't say we. They mostly have publicly funded elections. The U.S. is an outlier in that we rely, with a few exceptions at the state level, almost exclusively on private financing, and then we have pretty weak limits on that financing. So that just really sets us apart, and it sets us up for the kind of problem that the caller really, really emphasized. I want to be really clear about one last thing, though, is that, politics does cost money. It costs money to reach people. It costs money to organize people. So I tend to not love slogans like get money out of politics because that's not realistic. But really the question is, who is the money coming from? And as the caller noted, what do they want in return?
You're listening to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. We're talking about massive money in politics. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And we want to hear from you. What do you think? Is there too much money in politics? The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Our guest is Daniel Weiner, director of the Brennan Center's Elections and Government Program. So we're going to go right back to the phone, Daniel. Let's go to John on the east side. John, how are you? And is there too much money in politics?
Well, absolutely. It's absolutely outrageous. And when I think the other question is, where is all this money going and what is that being used for? Because you take a look at Representative Elizabeth Slock, and she spent $50 million. So that money all went somewhere. And what is that money being used for? My question for Daniel is the origin of corporations and the purposes of corporations and how that's morphed along the way.
Thank you so much for the call this morning, John. Daniel.
Yeah, it's a great question. The corporations date back to the founding of our republic. They are, and I'm not an expert on corporate law, but I think that people usually agree they were groups of people who joined together, sometimes for a charitable purpose, sometimes for a business purpose. I think that it is possible to say the nature of corporations is such that while they do have certain rights by virtue of being formed by natural people, those rights should not be treated identically as an actual person. And one thing would be that a business corporation or a charitable corporation, while it might have the right to speak on certain issues or the right to autonomy on some issues, shouldn't necessarily have the right to spend unlimited amounts of money on electoral politics, because that's just not the purpose for which we have corporations. And that actually, the dissent in Citizens United by Justice John Paul Stevens gets into that yes, corporations are a very important part of our society and our economy. That doesn't mean that we just rubber stamp treat them exactly the way we would, a natural person sitting across from you or me. The one other point I would make on Senator Slotkin, right, is what's fascinating now, of course, is that she raised money for her campaign, and so did her opponent, Mike Rogers. But actually more money for that election came from super PACs and other notionally separate groups than came from the candidates themselves. So that's the situation we're in, is partly someone like Senator Slotkin has to raise a ton of money, $50 million, because there's all this outside money streaming into the election, and she needs to get her message out. So we've put our elected officials actually also in a very difficult position with some of these rulings.
And Daniel, super PAC spending topped $1 billion in the last election. How does that much money affect our choices of candidates and the actions they take while in office?
It's a great question. I think money is a hugely important factor in our elections. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person who has the absolute most money wins. In the last presidential election, I think Vice President Harris had slightly more money than Donald Trump, and of course, President Trump won. But money functions, one, is a huge barrier to entry, right? Because if you don't have the capacity to raise, in the presidential case, hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, it's going to be unlikely that you're going to be able to mount a viable campaign. And then it does allow you, obviously, if you have a significant fundraising advantage over your opponent, to just kind of overwhelm them. What was interesting about super PACs in the last election is that Trump actually trailed Harris significantly in what we might think of as traditional fundraising. He raised a lot less money from small donors. He raised a lot less money even from large sort of traditional contributors who might give, say, $1,000. But he had the backing of these super PACs, particularly super PAC run by Elon Musk, and was able to make up a lot of that fundraising disadvantage using super PACs. Those super PACs were supposed to be separate from his campaign, but thanks in part to completely weak regulation and inaction by Congress and the executive branch, they really weren't separate. Musk actually took on a lot of the core functions of the Trump campaign, which itself kind of had a skeleton staff. So this really was in some ways the first election where super PACs were just completely integrated into at least one of the victorious general election campaign.
And it's so interesting, Daniel, because the last presidential election, we did see the Harris campaign raise a lot more money than the Trump's campaign did. $2.9 billion for Harris, $1.8 billion for Trump. But Trump's super PACs outraised the Harris-Biden ones. Is there something different? You talked a little bit about it, but I think it's important to stress that a little bit more, the difference between President Trump's financing approach that led to his super PAC success.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the way Trump did it was more efficient, because instead of having to raise all that money from individual contributors, Trump raised most of his money, or most of that money, from a small group of billionaires. One thing, if you look at the Harris campaign's finances, they raised a lot of money. They also spent a lot of money on fundraising. They spent a lot of money on online fundraising, because that kind of fundraising is expensive, right? You have to reach out to all those contributors. It's much more efficient if you just have a couple billionaires backing you and they can kind of bankroll your campaign. The worry, if you're someone who doesn't like the way that played out, of course, is that becomes the wave of the future. And, neither side wants to be at a disadvantage, and so both just become more and more reliant on super PACs funded by a handful of their very wealthiest donors.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham, and we're talking about money in politics.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Let's go back to the phones. Evan in Detroit, thanks for calling The Metro. How do you feel about money in politics right now?
How's it going? Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it's important when we talk about money in politics that we talk about the budgets and the appropriations that a lot of these politicians have. A lot of them have billions of dollars, especially at the federal level, even, some states where this is, what they preside over. So I think as long as you have these politicians that control these huge tax bases, you're going to have business interests and people that are going to give them money because they want to, have that influence. And a lot of times, it's set up through a foundation, or they might have a book, or they get, speaking fees. So when people talk about getting money out of politics, I think we have to really think about all the ways that, it happens and how these people, I guess the business interests are going to find a way to influence those politicians if they have access to these budgets and things that are going to affect their bottom line. So I don't see how you can separate the two in most instances, and I think we have to think about that when we talk about I think when people say get money out of politics, they really mean get money out of campaigns, but I don't think they want to, cut taxes or cut some of these budgets that these politicians have when they get in office, if that makes sense.
That does. Thanks for calling the Metro, Evan. Daniel, how do mega donors affect the budgeting process? One that's a lot harder to keep track of than, say, an election result. And where do lobbyists and special interest groups fit into this equation between elections?
It's a great question, and I think it was an insightful point about money in politics that the caller made. Look, we're going to see now coming up in Washington, at least, some of these huge fights around the budget, around taxes, around tariffs. And, certainly at the federal level, the top donors who backed Trump's campaign have a huge amount of money at stake in those fights. So it's going to be very important for journalists such as yourselves and watchdog groups and others to be looking and seeing, what sorts of budgeting and taxation and regulatory decisions are made, and how does that map on to who bankrolled the winning campaign. Your caller sort of notes that, to some degree, right, this is a function of that we have a modern, complex, big government that is a $1 trillion enterprise at the federal level and also a pretty big enterprise at the state level. But there are safeguards that you can put in place, right? If you have meaningful campaign finance regulation, if you have really strong ethics laws that can at least make sure that money is being spent for the public interest. So, yes, politics is sort of intertwined with money because the government spends a lot of money. But you ideally want that money spent for the benefit of everyone, not to kind of line the pockets of the folks who happen to be the very wealthiest campaign spenders. And we have in the past had much stronger rules that did help us maintain that kind of equilibrium. And the concern right now is that if you have such a confluence of private wealth and political power, you get a kind of self-perpetuating spoils system, right, where government money, is spent for the benefit of wealthy donors. And it's a pretty good return on investment, right, because as the caller noted, a couple $1 million in campaign contributions can potentially net you tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars in favorable government policies. So that's why actually controlling how campaign spending happens and who gives to campaigns is so important, because otherwise it just becomes a very appealing prospect to spend a little money and potentially get much more back from the government.
I want to take another call, Daniel, and hear from Brenda in Detroit. Brenda, thanks for calling the Metro. Is there too much money in politics right now?
Yes, it is. And that's to me, it's the wrong route we're going. We're putting money into politics, and we know what money does to people. They do stupid stuff. And that's what's happening now. As I listen to your program, we have to be, the working class people need to be vigilant about what is going on so they don't get caught up in this crap.
Thank you for calling the Metro, Brenda. You're listening to WDET. I'm Robin Vincent, and we're wondering for you, our listener, what you think. Is there too much money in politics? The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Our guest is Daniel Weiner. He's the director of the Brennan Center's Elections and Government Program.
And I'm Tia Graham. And Daniel, just want to refer back to Brenda. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think she's got a point, which is, I would extend to all voters that if you're upset about this and you care about it, you have to make clear to your elected officials that this is an important issue for you. I think that it's easy to fall in to kind of a little bit of cynicism and hopelessness. But there are actually, there have been many concerted efforts to impose some sanity on money in politics. And they were successful. There was actually a major bipartisan bill passed in, the early 2000s, the McCain-Feingold law, that did make our elections much more transparent until the court struck major parts of it down. So I think that it's just important to treat these issues seriously. We talk a lot in this space, and it's usually about Washington, but it could apply to Lansing too, of sort of under the dome strategies that are often used to defeat efforts to control campaign money, which is that, the sort of special interests who have a lot of clout in the Capitol find ways to defeat these bills, even though overwhelming majorities of the public support them. And it's incumbent on voters, if you want to overcome that, to really make clear to your elected officials that this is a really important issue for you, and it's an issue you vote on.
And Daniel, where do we go from here?
That's a great question. I think that there are a couple answers. So the first thing, which I've sort of been talking about, is that although the Supreme Court decisions were bad, they've been made immeasurably worse by inaction by Congress, by federal agencies. Over the medium term, if you want to see any improvement, you've got to get legislation passed in Congress and also at the state level. I know one thing that's under discussion right now in Michigan is an effort to make your elections more transparent, and that's a great first step, and it's something your Secretary of State, your governor, and others have talked about. So there are legislative solutions, and you need to press your elected officials to be serious about them. I think over the longer term, you need to look at the Supreme Court. Obviously, the courts are incredibly important. When they go off, though, on these huge ideological projects to, sweep away all of these safeguards, there needs to be some sort of check on it. And whether that is term limits for the Supreme Court, a constitutional amendment that would reverse Citizens United, at some point there needs to be some pushback. And states, in fact, need to start signaling that they do not accept this decision. And in that, you can learn a little bit even from folks who you might not agree with. The people who disliked Roe v. Wade, whatever else, spent years making clear how unhappy they were with that decision, and states passed resolutions, they passed laws pushing back on it. Eventually it was overturned. Whether you think that's a result that's good or bad, it's certainly a lesson if you're unhappy with Citizens United, which is that you don't just have to accept that that is the law and nothing can be done to change it.
And, if this decision is so, I'm thinking about the things that we're talking about right now, Daniel, and in what ways does this effort actually work? How does it look?
I mean, I think you mean the effort to push back on Citizens United?
Yeah.
I think it has to start with real legislative action. Like, if you really want to make a difference in the short term, you need to start with the basics, which is that the Supreme Court allowed all this new spending, but they seem to really assume that it would be transparent, and it's not. We don't know where a lot of it is coming from. And at a minimum, you should be able to ask your legislators, this should be a bipartisan issue, that campaign spending should be transparent. So if you got to start somewhere, that's a great place to start. Another great place to, that is a legislative change. And again, it comes down to building majority support for that in your legislature, in Congress, and holding elected officials accountable. And there are other legislative changes that you can make. Right now, I really do think we're sort of suffering a bit from a crisis of cynicism, where people are unhappy with money in politics, but they also kind of assume that it never can get better, that there's nothing they can do to change that. What I really think is you need to push back on that. You need to be like, you have to start by passing, telling your elected officials that you want them to prioritize this issue. You want them to make real changes. One change leads to another, and that builds an effort to actually push back.
Daniel Weiner is the director of the Elections in Government program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we'll hear about money in Michigan politics, and we'll get to your calls.
Stay with us on the Metro. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. The landmark Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, was 15 years ago. The ruling opened the door for dark money and mega donor influence in Washington. But its impact hits much closer to home. Michigan's politics are also impacted by Citizens United. Here to discuss dark money in our state is Simon Schuster, reporter for Bridge, Michigan. Simon, welcome back to the Metro.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. So how much campaign spending do we see in Michigan in 2024 compared to previous years?
Yeah, so Michigan in particular at the state level had two sort of major races. One was for the Michigan House, where control flipped from Democrats to Republicans after Democrats having a majority for the last 2 years. And then the other was in the Michigan Supreme Court, where Democrats maintained their advantage of a 5-2 majority by re-electing former state rep Kyra Harris Bolden and then electing a new Justice Kimberly Thomas. And so these were record spending years, both for the Supreme Court and the Michigan House, where we saw records broken, smashed really, in terms of the amount of money that flowed into these elections.
And Simon, who are some of the most well-funded politicians in our state, and which ones receive the most super PAC money in our state? I'm very interested in this question.
Yeah, so it's important to note, of course, that super PACs can't directly contribute to campaigns. Mm-hmm. What they can do is instead independently spend. And how the Citizens United changed our state campaign finance system is that in prior years, prior to the Supreme Court decisions, corporations or dark money nonprofits could not directly advocate for the election of candidates. But now, because of Citizens United, Michigan's campaign finance laws were later updated to essentially have our own version of super PACs. And through these, we were able to see that these entities, both companies and to a greater extent dark money nonprofits, were able to run ads that were explicitly saying vote for this person. And in terms of our own politics in Michigan, what we've seen over the past 3 or 4 elections is a particular concentration of outside money in the Supreme Court races. It's not that the Supreme Court races overall are more expensive than the state house races, because it's 110 seats over compared to 2 up for election, every couple of years here in Michigan. And but in the Supreme Court races, the candidates generally receive substantially less funding than we see in the House. And as a result, the outside funding that we see for these campaigns becomes that much more potent, especially in the Supreme Court race this year. We saw Democrats were buoyed by an enormous amount of dark money. We had groups that don't have to disclose their donors. They spent more than $5 million on the races, and that it exceeded the amount of money that the candidates themselves spent. And nearly all of this dark money spending was behind the Democratic candidates because of a nonprofit called Justice Project Action. They're able to give all of this money and explicitly tell people to vote in the nonpartisan section of their ballot for Democratic nominated candidates, and it proved a great boon for them. The Supreme Court candidates well outperformed the top of the ticket. They they had more votes than Kamala Harris in the state of Michigan and won by a much larger margin than she did.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking money in politics, and we've only got a few minutes left, but we want to get to more of our callers. David in Detroit, what do you think? Is there too much money in politics?
That's a hard question to answer directly because to run a legitimate House race for the legislature of Michigan, you're spending $150,000 to $250,000 largely on advertising. A Senate race is easily $1 million for the state legislature. So is it too much? Arguably, yes. But we have the cost of doing business for advertising and professionalism, right? So what I'm thinking more of is the caller from earlier asked, what did Senator Slotkin spend her money on? And there's an expense side of the ledger on the campaign finance reports, which leads me to the overall point is that the Secretary of State announced her campaign for governor today.
Jocelyn Benson, that's
Secretary
right.
of State is the keeper of campaign finance data at the state level, and then you have county level clerks keeping campaign finance data there as well. And both systems are incredibly hard to navigate to the point where it takes hours and hours and hours to extrapolate. You know, if you wanted to know what DTE Energy and CMS Energy PACs were contributing to members of the legislature, I spent 4 hours trying to unpack just the Senate Energy Committee's data over a number of years of reporting, right? So for Simon and the panel here, what kinds of things have voters been trying to do to unpack, you know, even an API from the Secretary of State to allow for better data transparency for what we have?
Thank you, David, for giving us a call on the Metro. I want to give Simon a chance to respond to that, if you would.
Yeah, I know we're short on time here, but David really hits the nail on the head. One thing that you hear from elected officials over and over is that when you talk to them, when they talk to the state officials that are responsible for administering a campaign finance system, they always complain about how difficult it is to file their campaign finance reports. And that's true. We have a campaign finance system in this state that really has not received much funding in years and years. The systems that these state officials have to work with, because they haven't had the funding in prior years to replace them, are really antiquated. They're decades old. And as a result, the data is really hard to look through. It's really difficult to actually follow the money unless you have some advanced data wrangling tools where essentially I'm here on my computer, processing the data myself because the state doesn't have the capabilities. And then the county level point is really important too, because unless you're running for a state level office, if you're running for a local seat, the vast majority of elected offices in our state, you're filing at the county level with your county clerk. County clerks are elected positions. Sometimes they just have 1 or 2 staff members working for them, and yet they're charged with administering a campaign finance system for their counties that can be really, really complex, has important reporting requirements, and they also have to technically enforce law. They have to be able to see what if there is a violation of the law. They have to be able to forward that on to the state and let officials know so then they can determine if there needs to be fines. But that almost never happens. And the reason in particular is because they don't have the resources, the support, the infrastructure to ever make that happen.
Simon, in the last 30 seconds that we have here, what are you keeping an eye on for the governor's race coming up? Do any of the declared candidates have a super PAC advantage?
So not quite yet, but Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan in particular is of interest to me because he ran for re-election as mayor with an enormous amount of outside support. He had dark money nonprofits that did the majority of the spending in his mayoral re-election. And the treasurer for his campaign now, his gubernatorial campaign, is a longtime political ally and one of the boards of directors from one of those dark money nonprofits. And I'm interested to see how much outside assistance he's going to receive as we move into this election.
We are interested as well. Simon Schuster is a reporter for Bridge, Michigan. Simon, thanks so much for your reporting, and thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me on.
The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.